All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Tonight is April 30th, a Tuesday. I want to thank you all for making it. I am Andrea, or Comrade Andrea. I will be facilitating tonight. Tonight's class is on the People's Schule. But before we get started, just a few reminders. The People's School is initiated and sponsored by the Party of Communists, USA, but it is not a party school, which is great because it allows us to have a wide variety of ideas and opinions discussed that don't necessarily reflect the party line. The People's School is also part of a long line of party-sponsored schools, such as the Workers' School, the Jefferson School for Social Science, the Center for Marxist Education, so on and so forth, until the present day of the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. This is a school, so please take notes. Please be respectful with your comments. Please don't leave early, and ask any of the co-hosts if you have a question or a link you need to share. All right. Thank you all, and we can begin the class.
Okay, so as the email said, today will be about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and we'll get started. So before that, we want to mention the People's Schule and United Jewish People's Fraternal Order. The People's Schule is an educational class under the auspices of the United Jewish People's Fraternal Order, and we're excited to work here with our friends at PSMLS to help get our name out. So real quick, this is what the People's Schule is going to stand for. So we educate in fraternity on secular, progressive lines to our Jewish and non-Jewish friends and our fellow travelers to share and relate the historical struggles of the Jewish people to other people's struggles against oppression. We join in our struggle for a free and independent Palestine. We trace our lineage to the events of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as we'll talk about today, the creation of Azerbaijan Autonomous Region in present-day Russia, and the protests against unlawful executions of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, which, we look forward to having educationals about in future classes. We live by the words, never again. But we believe these words mean never again for all people against oppression, and not just Jewish people. This means we stand up for all the rights of oppressed people, regardless of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, religion, etc. And so we are under the auspices, as I mentioned before, of the UJPFO, the successor of the JPFO, the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, and that was the Jewish section of the International Workers' Order. And over on the right there is actually the railroad station of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is the main town in the Russian Jewish Oblast Autonomous Region, founded in 1931. Yiddish and Jewish culture thrive in this area, where Jewish, along with other Russian people, reside in peaceful coexistence. And the world's largest menorah stands in front of the train station. And this is really what we are looking to create as our logo for the People's Schule. So that's exciting stuff. Okay, so today here's what we're going to talk about. The spirit of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Passover, the Nazi invasion of Poland and the creation of the Warsaw Ghetto, the different groups in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Jewish resistance underground and the events of the uprising. And then finally, we're going to relate the events to the Gaza Ghetto, what's happening right now in the Middle East. So let's start with the spirit of the Warsaw Ghetto and Passover. If you're practicing Passover, well, congratulations. I think right now you can finally eat regular bread, and I think I have pizza waiting for me, so that's exciting. But tonight is the end of Passover. And so we want to remember this was, if you participated last year in the UJPFO's Freedom Seder, you might remember some of these pictures that we used. So remember, we were once slaves. And Passover, being the oldest of the Jewish high holidays, the Jewish people have observed this festival for over 3,000 years in celebration of their deliverance from slavery. The Jewish people, during this holiday season, lift the torch of liberty and commit themselves to the unfinished battle for justice. We remember that in 1943, the events of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place during the Passover holiday. I think it was the Nazi invasion was on the eve of Passover of the ghetto. Since World War II, many Jewish families have conducted seders honoring the heroic stand of the Warsaw Ghetto martyrs against Hitler fascism. In the secular Jewish tradition, often joined by non-Jewish friends, the Passover story reaches out to all victims of oppression, regardless of their race, their sexual orientation, their age, whether they're black, brown, and white. And we remember the words, remember, we were once slaves. And so this comes from the Freedom Seder. So it's just kind of I guess a callback from last year, but we can never forget the bitterness of Egyptian slavery and the Warsaw Ghetto, and in our gratitude for or deliverance from Egyptian bondage in the tribute to the Warsaw Ghetto martyrs. We shall never forget our fellow men throughout the world who are still in chains, writhing to be free. We shall answer their pleas for brotherly aid. To do otherwise is to betray the cause of freedom. Okay. So now let's go into the Warsaw Ghetto. And what you see on the left there, that is from this piece of work by Charles R. Allen Jr. called The Immortal Warsaw Ghetto. It's got a really nice cover. The Warsaw Ghetto is like a great flame, which all shall light the path for men of goodwill in their unending struggle to achieve brotherhood, equality, freedom, and peace. Let us never forget that it was the Jews of Warsaw, from the horror and the terror and rubble of the ghetto, who rose up against the military might of history's most savage barbarians, the Nazis of Hitler Germany, and their Quislings, and struck the blow which for all time stands as one of the most inspiring, instructive, and imperishable monuments to humankind's fight against the tyranny of fascism in whatever form and from wherever it may rise. Together, the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto forged a unity at once inspiring and so important in its meaning for us today. From the streets and housetops, from the bunkers and rubble, from the stinking sewers of Warsaw, they, all of them, Zionists, religious Jews, Bundists, socialists, and communists, struck back at bestial Nazism and suffered it a mighty blow. For the Jewish fighters of the ghetto were a unique extension of the tradition of resistance to the death against the worst tyranny known to man, fascism. A tradition so eloquently expressed elsewhere in the global struggle which defeated Nazi Germany and the fascist Axis. You cannot say Warsaw Ghetto without adding Stalingrad, the Battle of Britain, El Alamein, Tarawa, and D-Day, and the fall of Berlin. We renew our internal pledge, never to forget and never to forgive, keeping in mind the basic meaning of the April Uprising. So what happened? So this is in 1939 when Nazi Germany invades Poland. So on September 1st, 1939, a wing of Nazi Stuka dive bombers roared in over Warsaw, the capital of Poland, and at a signal from their Luftwaffe leader, peeled off to bomb and strafe the ancient city, home of the largest Jewish community in Europe, the center of Jewish cultural, social, and political life in Poland. And by the way, this is coming from this material from the Immortal Warsaw Ghetto. For the ravenous anti-Semites of Hitler Germany, this was a most symbolic criminal act. And we could see the German forces and Polish civilians on the outskirts of Warsaw there. World War II was criminally launched by Adolf Hitler. Poland, soon occupied. Of the 3.5 million Jews living within the boundaries of pre-war Poland, the Nazis would murder over 3,200,000 of them. The Nazis set out deliberately and systematically to slaughter every last Jew in Poland. Poland's Jews were to be the prototypes of the Nazi plan for the final solution of the Jewish question in the Nazi invasions and occupations of all of Europe and the Soviet Union. Before this monstrous chapter in the annals of fascism was finished, 6.5 million Jewish men, women, and children would be murdered. Okay. And now we're going to play a video that comes from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. Okay.
With a pre-war Jewish population of over 350,000, Warsaw was home to Europe's largest Jewish community and a center of Jewish life and culture in Poland. The city fell to German forces in late September 1939. Beginning in October 1940, the Germans forced Warsaw's Jews, about 30% of the total population, into a ghetto that covered only 2.4% of the city. To prevent movement to and from the rest of Warsaw, the ghetto was closely guarded and enclosed by a wall that was over 10 feet high. Impoverished ghetto residents struggled for survival. In 1941 and 1942, Jews from surrounding communities were deported to the ghetto. At its height, the population exceeded 400,000. In July 1942, the Germans began mass deportations to the Treblinka extermination camp, about 50 miles northeast of Warsaw. Ghetto residents were forced to an assembly point and crowded into railroad freight cars. When they arrived at Treblinka, most deportees were killed. By September 1942, the ghetto population was reduced to about 55,000. In January 1943, the Germans renewed deportations from the ghetto. Members of the Jewish underground resistance groups inside the ghetto took to the streets to resist the roundups. The Germans deported 6,500 Jews before halting the operation. During the next few months, resistance groups and individuals constructed bunkers and worked to obtain arms. When deportations were renewed in April 1943, the vastly outnumbered ghetto fighters fought back in an uprising that lasted nearly a month. At the end, the Germans burned the ghetto to force people out of their hiding places. By May 16, 1943, the Germans had crushed the uprising and left the ghetto area in ruins. Surviving ghetto residents were deported to concentration or extermination camps.
Okay. So when Warsaw falls, the Nazis' first acts was the brutal segregation of the Jews from the rest of the Polish people by imposing on them the duty of wearing special white armbands with the blue Star of David printed on it. And you can see this lady trying to sell them, who's not in the best conditions, was the first step in the carefully planned preparation for the extermination of the Jews. Jews were forbidden to use any Aryan facilities of any kind. The next stage was the concentration of all the Jews of Poland into the larger urban centers. And once again, yeah, you could see the lady who's definitely definitely not doing well, but you can also see in the background all of these destroyed posters of the life that Warsaw knew before the invasion of the Nazis. So the first ghettos under Nazi Warsaw. In October of 1939, the first ghetto was established in Piotrkow. Then followed the ghetto in Lodz. And on October 2nd, 1940, the largest ghetto in the history of anti-Semitism was established in Warsaw, where eventually 650,000 Jews were jammed under inhumane condition. So 287,000 people were compressed into each square mile. The planning came on direct orders from Hitler and Himmler. which were carried out on a scheme worked out in meticulous detail by Adolf Eichmann. The Gestapo appointed a new community executive, or, as it was called, the Council of Elders of the Jewish community in Warsaw, and it consisted of 24 members and 24 delegates. All Nazi orders about the Jews of Warsaw were to be carried out by the council and its members. And just to remind ourselves, what is a ghetto? So a ghetto is a part of a geographical area in which members of a minority group are concentrated, usually based on ethnic or racial lines. It tends to be poorer than the areas adjacent to the ghetto. So another example of a ghetto besides the Warsaw Ghetto is the ghettos that we have here in the US that are mainly from redlining, and they consist of Black Americans. Okay, so the Judenrat, it's the Jewish police, and they were crucial to the Nazis' plan. So the Judenrat was set up deliberately by the Nazis, and the first task imposed upon the Judenrat was to conduct a census of Warsaw's Jewish population. Although there were hundreds of thousands of persons to register, the Nazis set a deadline a few days ahead. But they finished in time, and the Gestapo expressed itself as satisfied. The Gestapo was satisfied with the quick work of the Judenrats because they were hastening the ghettoization, the murder process itself for the Nazis. And the Judenrat was to become an instrument of anti-Jewish policy. The blows of the Nazis were struck at the Jews through the Judenrat, which acted as the Nazi agent of the occupation in the Jewish community. And you can see a picture there of two of those members of the Judenrat. October 16th, 1940, the Nazis officially proclaimed the establishment of the Warsaw Ghetto. It was before the Judenrat itself that the Gestapo appeared and issued their orders. All Jews in Warsaw must leave their apartments and move to the streets which are designated as the ghetto for the Jews. With that, the Gestapo agent produced a map of Warsaw showing the areas of the ghetto. And the Judenrat complied quickly and moved to set up a ghetto where Jews of Warsaw were to be driven. Many Jews, after finding out about the Judenrat's orders, fought, sometimes with their bare hands. But there was no unified militant leadership, and the Judenrat was working as, once again, the instrument of the anti-Jewish policies of the Nazis. And so the ghetto became a terrible fact. And there you can see the Polish civilians walking by the wall that separated the Warsaw Ghetto from the rest of the city.
All right, if anybody has any discussion or comments or insights into what we just heard, raise your hand and we will go in the order that they're generally raised up. That being said, Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Okay, I just want to give you some of the correct pronunciation of some of these words, because I've been saying them my whole life. These police that carried out the orders of the oppressor were called the Juden, like it starts with U. The Judenrat. It's a Yiddish word. The Judenrat. They were known as the traitors who carried out the orders of their bosses. The other thing, if you notice, the cities that a lot of this happened in Poland, those are cities that are now, some of them, on Ukraine. I want you to know that, because there's been a war that's always fought in that area between Poland and Ukraine for land. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment, Comrade Angelo.
Yeah, so my family from Poland, they're actually, they're not really communists, but they're favorable of the socialist period of Poland, and they look really harshly. They judge Poland as prior to World War II as fascist. Because some of them are very old and they're still alive. They lived during that time. They weren't Jewish; they were Polish. But I'm just wondering, was there laws in place in Poland because I've heard, I don't really know a lot about like the law situation. Was Poland like discriminating against Jews as well? Because that's something that I've always heard.
Yeah.
Because they were in the Warsaw Ghetto, I know that, but like what else was there?
Comrade Angelo, did you have an answer?
Yes. In the United States, we had laws at the water fountain. It said no blacks allowed. And in the black section in the ghettos in the United States, it said no whites could drink the water fountains here. It's the same kind of thing. Instead of using the word black, no blacks allowed here in the swimming pools, the public swimming pools. No blacks were allowed. I don't know if you know this. In New Jersey, in northern New Jersey, right near me, no blacks were allowed at the public swimming pools in the 1930s and in the early 40s. The same thing was carried out in Warsaw. No Jews allowed. So it's very interesting that we had our segregation laws and they had theirs about the same time. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Comrade Angelo.
Not so much about the laws, but more about just the sentiment, which was very anti-Semitic for a lot of the Polish population, which is why they so easily went along with the ghetto. It was like, finally, we can put the Jews in their place. And that's all.
Thank you for that.
Yes. So in the documentary that we watched, they had mentioned about Jewish resistance groups in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the question that I have is, what was the response at the time? Were they calling these groups terrorist groups like we see today? Or does anybody have any insight on that?
That's a good question. I wonder if terrorism was a thing back then. General Secretary Angelo, if you have an answer for that, you have the floor.
They were considered outside groups that were disorder to the community. If they were called actually terrorists, I don't think they were. I don't think it was used at that time. But I want people to know one thing. Poland is a heavily Roman Catholic country. Remember, it was the Pope in Poland during the socialist years who blessed a group called Solidarity, in Polish, Solidarność. Okay, that group was against socialism and against the government. They were blessed by the church. The church used that group. Remember that the early Roman Catholics, throughout, especially in Italy and Poland and Ireland, their view was that the Jews killed Christ.
90 seconds.
During the time of Roman times. That's why they were anti-Jews, because it came from a religion that the Jews killed Christ. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Comrade Angelo. I will get to the hands that are up. I just quickly wanted to generally ask, during the start of World War II, was there something inherently or more Jewish about Poland that the Germans invaded, or was it just next on their list, if anybody has a clarification on that? Because I always hear that World War II started with the invasion of Poland and they put extra effort to grab the Jews in Poland. I just want to know if maybe I missed it in the class, but anyways, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to answer the question. Yes, they were considered terrorists. Actually, we'll get into it in the next section, but this is where the idea of the good myth or the good Jew comes from. It's a myth. It basically was the Nazis telling the ghetto inhabitants, the imprisoned, whatever you call them, that the only reason why there's any maltreatment by the Nazis is because of the rebel rousers, the Jewish resistance forces. Yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit more later.
All right, thank you for that, Comrade.
I imagine this could be part of the educational later. So, like, who were the leaders of the uprising? And did they have any, like, communist affiliations or anything that we know of about that.
Next section.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Never a wrong question here.
Yeah, I want to touch on the context of 1939, the Polish government. So the Polish government was extremely reactionary, anti-communist, fascist type, ever since that famous leader, Pilsudski. Okay, and you know, Stalin had tried to come to collective security with France and England since 1933, but Poland always opposed the help of the Soviet Union because to them, they would rather have 1 year under Hitler than 1 day under the Red Army. That was their slogan. So when Hitler invaded Poland, France, England did nothing, didn't fire a shot. And after 15 days, Polish government, the state was beaten, and Stalin moved his troops about 150 miles going west in order to prevent the German army to be so close to Russia, to Soviet Union, right? But the Polish government in exile never accepted that. Even though they were fighting the Germans, they were fighting two enemies, the Germans and the Soviets. The Polish government in London, that's all.
Fascinating. Thank you for that, Comrade. All right, Comrade, you have the floor.
Yeah, the reason for invading Poland is that it was part of the Lebensraum program. It was simply just a scheme to conquer more territory for German business.
Oh, thank you for that. Okay, if there are no more questions, we can get to the second part of the presentation.
Okay. So yeah, we'll get into the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We did it from April 19th, 1943 to May 16th, 1943, but it must be noted that the initial deportations were scheduled for January 1943, but the Jewish residents blockaded all the streets and put up a fight against the Nazis. It caused a delay where then the resistance then organized. I also want to note that it was also selected on these dates because one, it was the beginning of the Jewish Passover, and two, April 20th was Adolf Hitler's birthday. So Heinrich Himmler wanted to give it to him as a present. You'll see how depraved that is. Okay, so I pulled this from an old Jewish Life magazine. It used to be the publication of the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, and now is being continued by United Jewish People's Fraternal Order. This was written by the editor, Morris U. Sheps. So why did the uprising happen so late? The lulling of Jews within the ghetto. The ghetto was seen as the escape. In the first place, there were many who accepted the very idea of segregation in the ghetto and found quote unquote national and spiritual comfort in the fact that the Nazis had arranged for a Jewish administration, the Judenrat, Jewish signs and outward symbols of authority, a Jewish police, while some Jews tried painfully to organize an underground resistance. Others were soothed by the fact that they could ride in Jewish-owned streetcars painted in blue and white with the Star of David, big and clear on the sides. Thus, Miss Sirkin, survivor, observes that to some, the ghetto even appeared as a shelter, while some who had escaped from Warsaw to Soviet territory returned to the Warsaw Ghetto of their own accord. They had heard that an autonomous Jewish community had been set up in Warsaw. Continued. Another factor was the Nazi abuse of the Jewish community's faith and education. An official school system was established, and certain types of cultural and artistic activities were encouraged in order to dupe the people. The idea was nurtured that so long as the Jewish youth could study the history and culture of their people, learn Yiddish and Hebrew and so forth, a future of death was incredible. This idea had deep popular roots. The Nazis depended on that. Shortly before the official liquidation of the ghetto began on July 22nd, 1942, during the next 8 weeks, about 300,000 Jews were deported to death. The Nazis allowed the Judenrat to organize several new elementary schools and kindergartens as a blind almost to the very end. Those who preached self-education as a substitute or a foil for resistance did not serve our people well. False sense of security seen from Roman Polanski's Pianist. Could you pull that up?
Du Bandit! Pum, pum! Kaputt! Kaputt! Dann krieg ich aber richtig Angst. Ingel! Halt hoch! Zigaretten! Danke schön! Alle klar!
Ja klar, alle sind gleich. Alle Menschen sind gleich. Nur wir Deutschen sind ein bisschen gleicher.
Alle klar! Alle klar! Alle klar! Alle klar! Alle klar! Alle klar! Ingel, halt hoch! Ingel, halt hoch! Alle klar!
Stop it. You can stop it now. Yeah, so I chose that clip because you can see at least for a part of it, the Nazis put on a facade that they were friends of the Jewish people in the ghetto. As we have seen through history, that was a lie. Okay, well, my slide seems to have disappeared, but I had a slide that talked about how the Judenrat was basically the Jewish section of the Gestapo, and they pushed this idea that as long as the Jewish people did not resist and showed up to the deportation lines on an orderly schedule, then there would be no mistreatment of the Jewish people. This is kind of to go with what I was saying earlier. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah, if anybody has any more comments, questions, or insights, raise your hand and we will get to you as soon as possible. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Thank you. If you notice, the woman was starving. They were all starving. In the ghetto, the food was measured by the occupier. If you'll notice, that's going on today. The new ghetto today, the biggest ghetto in the world by everyone, is the one in Gaza. Gaza has become a ghetto. It's the people that are controlling it as the Israeli government, very similar to what the Nazis did. And the people looked free. They were allowed to do what they wanted inside, but their life was miserable. There was no future, and starvation was rampant because there wasn't enough food. I just want to say the historical connection to what we see today is very, very close. In fact, it's my personal belief that the Zionists learned everything from when they were victims of the Nazis in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Comrade Angelo.
Yes, did any members of non-Jewish Polish resistance help in the ghetto uprising, like the group that later did the Warsaw Uprising over a year later?
Yeah, so I actually miscalculated. It's the next section that's going to talk about it. But yes, there were Polish partisans, and Stalin helped create the Polish Workers' Party, which was the de facto communist party of Poland, and then airlifted them into occupied Poland to set up a resistance.
Thank you for that answer. All right, comrade, you have the floor.
Going off of Angelo's comparison, how does our current analysis to the Al-Aqsa flood operation, how does that relate to or differ from the Comintern analysis and our analysis on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising?
All right, valid question. If anybody has a more specific answer, feel free to raise your hand.
And in the next section, we will actually discuss exactly that. So we'll wait on that, but it's a good question. That's why we brought it up in the slides. I wanted to bring up what Angelo mentioned about the Zionists. You know, the Zionist movement really started in the 19th century, and it was nothing. Like Lenin never wrote about the Zionist movement because it was very fringe. However, they were goaded by the Nazis, thinking that they would go to Palestine in response to working with the Nazis. And sometimes, if you read that Shapes article that you can find on ujpfo.org, it talks more specifically about the young Zionists and how they were told to go outside and toil the land a little bit so they could learn how to do that in Palestine. And once they realized that these were all just lies by the Nazis, that's when they joined the resistance. So it's interesting, kind of like the video that we just watched from that movie. That's all.
Thank you for that answer. I just wanted to quickly say, and I know it's obvious and people know it, but when people are pushed to a brink of extinction, the only thing you can do is fight back. And I just wonder why sometimes, even in the most desperate times, some people back in World War II just didn't fight back. Anyways, Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Oh, it's going to go into the next part. So I just wanted people to know that during Lenin's time, the issue was the Bund, B like boy, U-N-D, which in Yiddish or German, it means like a union. The Bund was the competitors to Lenin. They believed that the Jewish workers needed their own organization. In fact, to me, I lived through the New Left. The Bund reminded me very similar of what we learned in the New Left, that blacks should have their own organization, work together with whites in a coalition. That's what the whole thing of Black Panther was when I went through that in the 60s. Students for a Democratic Society was white. No blacks were allowed. And I don't know if you know this. In SDS, the blacks went into the Black Panther movement, and they worked together. That's what this reminds me of, that the Bund was supposed to organize the workers, whereas the non-Jewish workers were going to be in Lenin's party, the Bolshevik party. And Lenin fought against that. And the Zionist movement was nothing. The majority of Jews in the world that were politically active were active either in the communist movement at that time or the Bund. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Comrade Angelo.
Wondering a little bit on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, what the sort of international response was to it, because of course there wasn't like, Instagram and news articles that are, so prevalent as they are today during the Gaza genocide. But I imagine there must have been some information that went around the world about it. Were there protests? And with that question as well, if it was known at all, how did the American communist parties react?
Hey, thank you for that question. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Yeah, the world did nothing. Does that sound familiar? The world did nothing. The only people that were involved in protesting, leading the protests, were the communists for obvious reasons. The communists were opposed to the Nazis to start with. And so the horrors of the ghetto, the way they were treated, there was the communists. Remember, anti-Semitism was the number one thing in the communist movement. And remember what Stalin said about anti-Semitism. You know what he called it? He went out of his way to attack anti-Semitism. He said it's like a person that eats another person. What is that word called? When you eat people.
Cannibalism.
Cannibalism. That's the word he used. Look it up. Google it. He called it cannibalism, anti-Semitism. I thought that was very interesting that Comrade Stalin, of all people, came out with that position. Thank you.
Thank you for that wise wisdom, Comrade Angelo. Comrade, you have the floor.
Yeah, so I mean, on top of there being deafening silence, there were also, there were refugee ships that were sent, with Jewish refugees to the U.S. that were turned back and sent back to Europe, where they were going to be slaughtered. And in the next section, we'll even see there was a ship full of Jewish refugees being sent to or on its course to Palestine at the time, and it was torpedoed by a British ship. So it was definitely hostile.
Thank you for that, Comrade. Comrade, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. So we actually have recorded Lenin's voice, and one of the few recordings that we have of his voice was one of his speeches on anti-Semitism, and he has a very concise, very cordial, very very concise answer as to the origins of anti-Semitism and how the Communist Party at the time, the Bolshevik Party, was deal with it. So it's very fascinating to see that we do have that history archived and translated into English for us to understand, because truly, we analyze, for example, the kind of anti-Semitism that was pushed before, like Angelo mentioned, the Jews killed Christ, quote unquote, and there's a whole other aspect of the Nazis who came from a not very Christian perspective, but they synthesized their own hatred based off of their own kind of ideology. That's all I got to say.
Very insightful. I was just on YouTube right now looking for that speech. I remember seeing it where he says not to blame the Jews because they're under their capitalist masters just like us. They're no different, but it seems to be gone. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Yeah, this people here should start doing their own research. You have to see the connection in Hitler's time, between Hitler's Nazis and the Zionist movement. It's fascinating. There's a famous woman, a Jewish woman historian. Her name is Hannah Arendt. The last name is A-R, I think it's E-N-D-T. Hannah Arendt, you should get books by her. She wrote a book called The History of Jews in Europe. And Hannah Arendt is hated by the Zionists. They hate her guts because she shows the connection between the Zionist and the fascists in Germany, because they wanted to get rid of the Jews, and the Zionists will say, "Oh yeah, let's get rid of them and bring them to Palestine." So there's the correct connection, and they worked hand in hand. The other question is, remember, there are people in the Arab world, some people who worked hand in hand with Netanyahu's government, who were helped financially by Netanyahu's government. And this is not a slander. It's done. There's a whole study of it, and because they wanted for the reasons that they wanted. So there's cases in history of two opposites working together. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I saw all the hands pop up. We will get to you. We are going to get to the next part of the presentation, but I will take maybe one more hand of somebody who hasn't spoken.
So the name is Hannah Arendt, not Hannah Arendt, but I haven't really read her position on this work. I am familiar with who she was. She definitely was like New Left sort of stuff, but she was also anti-communist. But if she took that position, I'd be very pleasantly surprised. As far as what Angelo is saying about like the Arab governments, one thing that people have to understand is that the founder of Israel, Ben Gurion, I think that's his name. There's a quote of him where he says that like the death of the Jews in the Holocaust was worth it. He says it was worth it because it resulted in the creation of Israel and the creation of the Zionist movement. Because remember that Zionism was considered fringe among Jews, like before the Holocaust was like fully known, and all of a sudden everyone jumped on board that train once that occurred, right? The other thing I wanted to point out was that as far as the Arab governments are concerned, the King of Jordan, Jordan's been pro-Israel since the very beginning. The King of Jordan is half British, and all these Arab, especially the Gulf monarchies, are all paid to be silent and to be complicit. So just that's some context for you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Always insightful. All right, we'll get to the next part of the presentation, and then we'll have a final round of questions.
Resistance. There's the flag of the Jewish Combat Organization, ZOB. It was an anti-fascist popular front consisting of trade unionists, communists, socialists, left-leaning Zionists, and democratic elements of Jewish people and general Zionists. It was composed of Hashomer Hatzer from Builders Freedom, a labor Zionist organization, the Jewish section of the Polish Workers' Party, the Communist Party of Poland, Habonim Dror, the Socialist Zionist organization, Poal, the Labor Zionist organization, and the Jewish Labor Bund. And pictured on the left is the Jewish ghetto police with the armbands, or the armband is right on top. And then on the bottom are two members of the Warsaw Ghetto police. Oppression. There were Nazi henchmen within the Warsaw Ghetto, the Judenrat, the Jewish council set up by the Nazi Gestapo to ensure as little resistance to Nazi occupation and exportation of Jews to Treblinka extermination camps. And the Jewish ghetto police set up by the Judenrat to enforce Nazi orders within the ghetto. Important organizers and commanders of resistance. So there was Mordecai Anielewicz from Hashomer Hatzer, Michael Rosenfeld from the Polish Workers' Party, Adam Berman from Poal, Sonia Novograduka from the Jewish Labor Bund, Henok Kirschbaums of the Democratic Elements of the General Zionist Movement, Ilya Moses, a member of the International Brigades during the Spanish Civil War, and they would train the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance. He would train the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance until his death in summer of 1942. And on the right, there's a picture of Mordecai and Aniel, I can't really pronounce his name, Anielewicz, the Uprising. Of the 40,000 who were in the ghetto when the rising took place, most were annihilated. The Nazis lost more than 1,000 troops, materials, time, and prestige, and it was more than individual Jews that survived. An example survived and spurred on resistance in other ghettos, in death camps, and in other partisan movements. Jewish unity against fascism survived and has been, since the end of the war, the basis of the all-party unity of the Central Committee of Polish Jews. The democratic unity of Jews and non-Jews survived, and is now the basis for the fact that the Jews are an honored, and in some respects, because of their great losses, a favored part of the new democratic Polish government. That's an excerpt from Resistance is the Lesson, the Meaning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Was the Soviet Union a passive witness to Nazi crimes in the Warsaw Ghetto? The Polish Workers' Party role in the uprising. Much has been written of the inadequate and grudging aid given the ghetto fighters by the Polish underground that had its headquarters in London and that apparently had other more important objectives than to fight the Nazis. Not enough is yet known in this country of the splendid aid rendered by the Polish Workers' Party, founded in January and February 1942, with headquarters in Lublin. Thus, Krystyna Kowalska, secretary of the Warsaw branch of the PPR, was almost a daily conspiratorial visitor in the ghetto during the preparations for the uprising, supplying contact, arms, and instructors, limited only by the available means. In January of 1942, Polish communists were parachuted into occupied Poland by the Red Army, and with the assistance of the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, formed the Polish Workers' Party. Note, Polish underground in the passage refers to the national Polish government in exile located in London. There's a monument to Stalin in Birobidzhan, the Jewish autonomous oblast. And this is an excerpt from Stalin and the Jewish People by Louis Harrop. The spirit of Stalin, which animated Soviet policy of wiping out the centuries-old persecution of the Jewish people, as well as all national oppression, still reigns in the Soviet Union and has been extended to the people's democracies. The hysterical campaign against anti-Semitism in these countries is the unenviable feat of standing facts on their head. As the venerable leader of the Negro and American people, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and said in his tribute to Stalin on March 9th, "Let all Negroes, Jews, and foreign-born who have suffered in America from prejudice and intolerance remember Joseph Stalin, this son of a slave in Georgia, as Commissar of Nationalities, fought prejudice and particularism, and helped build the first modern state which outlawed race discrimination. As the years pass, the stature of Stalin as one of the great men of this century will emerge ever more clearly, and his leadership in the liberation of peoples, including the Jewish people from centuries of oppression, will take on greater clarity. It was the Western Allies that stood idly by. The spark was dispatched to London, according to a marginal note to the above text in a copy recently found in Białystok. It replied to the SOS of the few remaining doomed Jews. The Anglo-Saxon world remained silent. The English torpedoed 2 ships transporting several thousands of Jews seeking shelter in Palestine. In Poland, the underground representative of the London Emigre government replied to the appeal of the Jewish Fighters Organization for arms and instructors that the time for military action against the enemy had not arrived. At the same time, these representatives demanded an understanding with the Jews that any arms given to them should later be used against the Red Army. Since the doomed people in the ghetto refused to comply with such terms, they received no munitions. Despite the unprecedented German terror, despite the cold, or at best passive attitude of the AK Home Army, despite the resigned attitude prevailing among the hungry, maltreated prisoners of the ghetto, 1943 marked the turning point of resistance. Act of desperation or act of inspiration. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not a struggle in defense of one's earth, because by April of 1943, there really was no expectation of holding back the enemy, wrote the world-famous historian and fighter of the ghetto, Professor Bear Mark. The struggle was not calculated to save the lives of near and dear ones, because they had already been murdered. This was not a struggle to save one's own life, because one's own life was difficult to endure in any case. The struggle was generated by driving moral forces on a much higher plane. This was a struggle for the honor of a people, for its future. The irresistible urge came from their determination to uphold the honor of the Jewish people. This was the main goal of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in April of 1943. From Strategy for Survival by Bear Mark, translated from Yiddish and published in Jewish Life. And there's an unveiling of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial in Warsaw in April 19th of 1947. And there's an image of someone killing one of the heads of like the fascist beast. The Gaza Ghetto, a modern-day Warsaw Ghetto. The Gaza Ghetto, a modern-day Warsaw Ghetto. Today in 2024, you see a similar situation going on in the Gaza Strip. Since the 1967 war, the Israeli government, through occupation of the territory, has forced the civilians of Gaza into an inhumane blockade. The Palestinian ghetto of Gaza and its residents have been cut off from the rest of the world. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas on earth with miserable living conditions created by an economic and commercial blockade. Since the start of its blockade on Gaza, Netanyahu's regime has been controlling Gazans' food, gas, water, electricity, etc. Since the current hostilities, the Netanyahu government has completely blockaded all goods and aid into the Gaza ghetto. These conditions have created acts of resistance. Palestinian resistance has arisen in these conditions and launched a fierce assault on Israel. Much like what the Nazis planned for the Jews in Warsaw, the goal of the ghettoization of Gaza is to eventually remove or liquidate the population from its land.
Before we go to the discussion, I wanted to make a note on one of the I included the section with the Soviet Union because there's this in the West there's this mainstream view that Stalin ignored all the cries for help from the Jewish people in Warsaw, but it was completely absurd. In 1941, the Nazis unleashed a full invasion into the Soviet Union. It wasn't until 1944 that the Soviet Red Army was pushing back into Poland and further west. So the Red Army had its hands tied up. I just wanted to bring that up because none of that would have happened had the British not given carte blanche the Czech Republic if they didn't have Hungary, or not Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and then the Baltic states, which all had their fascist governments in power. So the Soviet Red Army had a lot to contend with before they could get to the Polish side.
And real quick, a quick correction. It wasn't just the Netanyahu regime that caused the blockade. It's been going on since 1967. So just a small correction.
Thank you for that clarification. And yes, our last round of questions and comments, your last chance to ask anything related to this situation.
Yeah, like the one the book, the excerpt said that like 1,000 Germans were killed, but I looked in Wikipedia, it said like only 17 were killed, and also to replying to wasn't Jordan a part of the coalition against Israel during the 1948 war, I guess? Thanks.
All right, if you have the answer for that, raise your hand. In the meantime, Comrade, you have the floor.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give, I guess, kind of a correction or kind of just clarifying on the last part about the Gaza similarities. People have been forced into Gaza ever since 1948 with the Nakba, and I know that sometimes we want to avoid that, but I think that that's some critical thing to note here, is that the entire occupation of Palestine has forced people into places like West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it's not just been since 1967, it's been since before then. But I wanted to say, with the similarities to the Warsaw Ghetto, you see that the people in the Warsaw Ghetto did take up arms against the Nazi forces. And that's something that we see today in the Gaza Strip. So whatever we think about the different forces of the Palestinian resistance, we have to understand that their fight is a just fight, and that they're struggling under even harsher conditions in some instances than the people in the Warsaw Ghetto. So I just wanted to add that.
Oh, thank you for that. Absolutely true.
Yeah, no, I was going to say what did, whereas there's this conception that the Soviet Union did nothing for the Warsaw Ghetto. I even personally remember my high school textbook saying like the Soviet troops waited outside Warsaw as it happened, and then after the Nazis crushed it, moved in, which is complete bunk. And also during that period where the Germans first invaded Poland, the French and the British were all stacked up on the border. They could have easily overrun the western positions of the Germans, but it was basically called the Sitting War then, where they just basically everyone just stood on the side and looked at each other. Thank you.
Yeah, it's annoying to me that Western like propaganda spreads so easily.
I just asked really quickly because also said, funny. I saw my TikTok. Somebody like also mentioned that about the Soviets waited outside of Poland while this was going on, and they let it happen, which I thought was funny. But I was also gonna ask because there's a lot. I know there's a lot of parallels and more regarding the West Bank. I don't know if we would consider like the Palestinian Authority, like I guess a parallel to like the Judenrat, or like I guess playing like a similar role, or yeah, I don't know if somebody could clarify.
Thank you for that very good question. If you have the answer, yeah, there you go. You have the floor.
Yeah, I would say that it's a very similar situation. I mean, we got to remember, right? Basically, the Palestinian Authority was created under Oslo Accords, and it was basically what drives a current wedge in the unification of a Palestinian state right now today, because you have what that did was that created basically a wedge, and you have Fatah, which was Yasser Arafat's party and is now currently chaired by Mahmoud Abbas, in control of the West Bank. But then around 2006, there was the election that basically they wanted the Palestinian Authority to win, the Israelis and Americans and all that sort of stuff, and then Hamas won. So Hamas has been in control of Gaza since 2006. And, you know, one of these groups is pro-resistance, one of them isn't. You know, the Palestinian Authority is a group that is anti-resistance, whereas the basically Hamas is a resistance group. And this is kind of what is basically preventing a Palestinian state from being brought to fruition even today. So
very well said, very well said. Comrade, you have the floor.
So in response to this question earlier about the, what's it called? Coalition. Yes, Jordan was part of that coalition. However, so was Saudi Arabia, so was Egypt, so were a lot of countries that today, because first of all, the Jordanian monarchy was approved and placed there by the British. And like when the British colonized Africa in the Middle East, right? And in India, often they would like use like the local monarchies and use the local warlords. And like then they would like get a slice of like the pie. They would get some money or golden tribute. And then like the local warlords or kings would then say, okay, we approve of this colonization. We approve of you guys coming in. And therefore, like, don't revolt or whatever. That's what they did with the Mughal Empire in India. So that's kind of like the origins of the Jordanians. But I wanted to say, they are paid. The people who run the Jordanian, Saudi, and Egyptian governments, they have business ties with the United States. If they ever went against that, their entire economies would crash overnight. And that's why, so their entire economies are kind of dependent on them being sellouts. So that's why things are the way they are. In Syria, the one country that's like still pro-Palestinian, the US completely destabilized it and is trying to launch a color revolution against the legitimate leader, Bashar al-Assad. Yeah.
Thank you for that, comrade.
Yes, two things. Okay, first, earlier, Angelo talked about the collaboration between Zionism and the Nazis. So there's there's one author, he's a Jewish historian. His name is Lenny Brenner, and he wrote two books, very controversial, one in 1983, one in 2010, and one is called Zionism in the Age of Dictators. And the second is called 51 Documents about the collaboration between Nazis and Zionists. Okay, very interesting. You got to read it. Second, comrades, you had a little confusion here, and I'm talking. There was two Warsaw Uprising. There was the Ghetto Warsaw Uprising of May 1943, and then there was the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944. That's the one you mentioned, the Red Army camping outside of Warsaw. There was a big controversy. What happened is the Home Army which was the London capitalist bourgeois government, initiated an uprising ahead of the Red Army because they wanted to liberate Warsaw before the Red Army, because they wanted a capitalist Poland, obviously. And they did not coordinate with the Russian army, the Red Army, and they were smashed by the Germans. It was a very sad situation. And then they blamed the Red Army. Red Army couldn't do anything. They were already exhausted from the Bagration offensive of summer 1944. They could not go any further. If they had waited a little bit and coordinate with the Red Army, they would have won. But instead, it was a massacre in 1944. But that's not the one we're talking about today, okay?
Thank you. I did not know that. Thank you. All right. Comrade, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just have to mention, there are similarities. I actually will, I think, pull from Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And there are similarities between the Gaza ghetto, in the West Bank situation and Warsaw Ghetto, but we can't equate them. I do not think the PA is equatable to the Judenrat of Warsaw. I mean, that to me sounds a little ridiculous. They were literally there to enforce the fascist regime, which executed helped execute all the Polish Jews. I think also the PA is tied. There's some corruption, but to equate it to what was said earlier is not the same thing. They condemned what President Biden said about not recognizing the Palestinian state. They are not the same as the PLO as well. They were set up by the PLO, and there's some controversy between them. I think we have to look at the Middle East and Israel specifically as a post-Zionist state, same way we can look at South Africa as a state without white supremacy, and the same with the U.S. We wave the American flag because we're Americans. We look at our racist past, as we were going to improve from that. And I think that's the way we have to look at it, as Marxist-Leninists, as progressives as well. That's all.
Thank you. All right, Comrade, you have the floor.
Okay, I just wanted to say it's been an interesting class. A lot of things I didn't know. Definitely something that I feel like we should probably get another class on. I would like to see a class of Poland post World War II, like the Soviet government, because that's an area that I don't really have much information about.
All right, thank you for that. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Yeah, we need to have a separate class on this because there's a lot of confusion. I am listening to a lot of confusion. I hear analysis that is not historically correct. So we need another class, but this is on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The issue of the PLO and the Oslo Accords, it needs to have a whole class on that. It's my understanding that Netanyahu never wanted his party, never wanted a state of Palestine. So they killed Rabin, who was the Israeli pushing for that. Also, and that has to be brought up in a class. Also, the amount of evidence, it's not just one or two, but let's actually open the door and let it out. The amount of evidence of why Netanyahu wanted to destroy the PLO. And so he funded FUNDED, and it's all there in evidence. No. I think we should have a class on that, on how he funded the Hamas. So I think it's not as simple as some of the people are trying to present.
And from our New Outlook publishers.
Yes, thank you. Please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You can find it at newoutlookpublishers.store. Today we released our first ebook, which is The Donbass Cowboy by Russell Bentley. You can find that on the website at newoutlookpublishers.store, and a link to wherever you can get the ebooks. Once again, and of course, purchases through our New Outlook Publishers help support the school. And once again, the web address is newoutlookpublishers.store. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade.
So this is Go Down Moses by Paul Robeson, which, talks about the story of Exodus, the Passover story, but relating it to the current situation now in Gaza. So bear with me and I'll get that started.
When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go.
Thank you for watching this full-length class from the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. For more information or to join our free classes, visit our website, check out our YouTube, listen to our streams on Spotify, and chat with us on Reddit.